Research Journal, Astrowave, which was relaunched in fall of 2020. It contains diverse works of research from across multiple disciplines through an Islamic lens. Today's presenters are the authors of our upcoming issue of the journal to be published in fall of 2021 and represent an intriguing array of topics. Just before we get started, a few housekeeping rules. If you are attending the conference through your computer, you can post your questions in the Q&A tab, which you can find when you click the 3 dots at the bottom right of your WebEx screen. Please make sure you send your questions to all panelists so we can all see them, and we look forward to a rich discussion. Likewise, if you are attending this conference through your phone, you can click on the 3 dots at the bottom of your screen, which will show you the Q&A options. Now, to start us off, I would like to first welcome Dr. Tuck to deliver the opening remarks. Dr. Mohammed Evren Tuck is the Assistant Dean for Innovation and Community Engagement at CIS. He also acts as the Program Coordinator for the Master's Program in Islam and Global Affairs at CIS, and is a member of the Advisory Board for the Astroliberal Student Research Journal. Dr. Evren, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate your kind words, and also, if I may kindly ask my colleague Ezzedine to give me the globe to share my screen. So I will immediately start my presentation, inshallah. But before, I would like to congratulate you all and everyone who actually played a role in this wonderful event, and organizers, presenters, our colleagues in HBK.com. So well done. This is really wonderful. And you reminded me of the very first graduate conference I had a chance to present my work in 2002. So almost 20 years ago. So almost, when I was a master's student. So without further ado, I wanted to do something a little bit extraordinary. It is not a traditional opening remark, but I just wanted to kind of touch on something that's dear to me, which is a bit disruptive thinking. So let me share my screen, and then afterwards, and if I can get, I can see Sabika actually, if she can validate that my screen is visible.
Yes,
okay.
Dr. Everett, it's perfect.
So this is the screen I want to start with. You may know the Maker Majlis. It is taking a lot of my time, and what I feel that what you do in this amazing event is a great illustration of the very important message that we have been trying to give in Maker Majlis, that student-driven approach, student initiatives, students taking the lead and producing. So, and today is also another example of we design new normal, because yes, there are extraordinary times. There are actually a lot of challenges that impede our ability to get together. But on the other hand, we are able to adjust to the new normal, which is organizing our regular events on a digital format. Who knows, maybe things will change, but definitely we will be in a new normal. So I believe that our event is a good example of what Maker Majlis Design Post-COVID Humanity has been illustrating. So I wanted to deeply share with you that the whole Maker Majlis community is also wishing today's presenters and audience a splendid experience. And it means a lot to us to be able to work together. So, so let me get started. What do academics do? Maybe you are not familiar with this object, but this has been found in November 2020, just 6 months ago, in United States of America, in Utah. And this is considered as a monolith. Okay, it's like a metallic constellation, and in the middle of nowhere. There's no need for details. And you know who discovered this? Biologists, when they were actually doing this really extraordinary work in the middle of this area, remote area that no one goes, no one sees, right? But people believe that this metallic, monolith has been put here at least 4 years before it has been discovered. So, which means that academics are the ones, scientists are the ones, they understand what's happening in a different way in the world, like what are certain kind of things that are unusual, right? So, and right after that, so this was November 2020. And by the way, no one knows who installed this monolith. And then it disappeared in a very mysterious way. And then something happened on 26th of November in Romania. A similar monolith emerged. And again, it disappeared after a while, and no one knows what happened to that monolith. Okay, so imagine in the past 6 months, there are monoliths in different parts of the world. Next one in California, there's another monolith, and not this one is a bit different, a bit taller, but again, no one saw who put it, and then it disappeared again. Like, what's happening, right? And then Veneto, Italy, on the 2nd of February this year, again, another monolith suddenly appeared next to a restaurant, and no one knows where it came from. And I started to kind of follow this discussion, like what's happening in the world, why people are putting monoliths in a mysterious way, why they are disappearing, and why they are becoming so kind of like a big issues in national agendas. And then I came up with this website, monolithtracker.com, and I learned that actually there is this tracker. And as of right now, since the first monolith in 2020, November, the one in Utah, there has been 216 monoliths. And what was so important was now there's even a community in the world. They are categorizing the monoliths. They put letters, like class S for the significant ones. Class P is possibly significant monoliths. Class Q is the questionable or verified ones. Like the kind of the knowledge, the information we are processing, like we are getting new things, and we are trying to, first thing we do with the new information is we are categorizing it, like academics do, right? That's when you first get something, you try to categorize it, you try to understand its nature, and you try to kind of make it work or make it fit into our existing knowledge. But then 216, and all over the world, there are monoliths in the past 6 months, and most of them are unknown. So then I started to think, what does it tell us for academics, right? Like academic inquiry is about getting closer to the reality, and it requires you to move out of your comfort zone. So like the people finding these monoliths, they are identifying patterns. There's a pattern of life, but when someone sees a monolith that doesn't belong to the nature, right, it's a metallic constellation, it's a rupture, right? So we are academics, like, or you guys are as emerging young academics, you are trying to understand regularities in life, ruptures, patterns, or irregularities. You try to identify changes or continuities, divergences or convergences, right? Variations, meanings, representations, or manifestations of different values. So I thought about, when I saw this whole events happening around the monoliths, I thought of like the academics, who are, by the way, most of the monoliths are discovered by academics because they are the ones that always on the field trying to capture reality. And they are the ones actually looking at things with a critical eye. So, and then I started to think deeper. Each monolith has a producer, like an author. And each monolith has an audience, like the academic community. Like, look at the kind of the analogy right now. Each monolith is unique, but not isolated. It is connected to the conception of monoliths, because like the concepts, there can be a concept of, let's say, authoritarianism or government or liberalism, but still you see different manifestations of that concept. So monolith, it becomes like a kind of a tool for you to move from induction to deduction, right? At the beginning, there was one monolith, one case, but now we are a sample size of 216. So we are able to understand why they're happening. as if like we are doing an academic inquiry. Each monolith has a different reception by the society. Sometimes governments remove it right away. Sometimes they are burned down by the communities. They're saying this is by aliens, we have to burn it down. Or sometimes it's a heritage and the governments preserve it. So like the disciplines, every discipline has a different take on the new inquiry, right? Each monolith has a context. The way people explain that monolith or try to understand, make use of that monolith, it's a paradigm that we are living in. And paradigms define our analysis of our context. Each monolith is a reality. It has a message to deliver. We shouldn't forget that. It's a way of reacting to the world, the way the world works right now. And people, although they are totally unrelated to each other, but still they are using the same message, right? And I want to give you, actually, I said a message to deliver, right? One of the most recent monoliths that has been discovered was actually in Turkey, in the city of Urfa. And this monolith actually was a little bit interesting because it had actually something written on it in old Turkic language, okay? And immediately the government actually put the soldiers, protection, and because people didn't know where this monolith came from, like everybody was so surprised, and they brought a lot of archaeologists and a lot of experts to understand even the language, which actually belonged to like a very super old Turkic phrase. And you know what it says, this phrase? If you want to see the moon, look at the sky. So my point to you guys actually is that if you want to take this message, you guys are looking at the sky. You are trying to see the moon because you are trying to see the reality. And these days, there are so many alternatives to reality that are unfortunately affecting our senses. And for academics, please always look at the sky if you want to see the reality. And finally, later on, people realized that this monolith was used by the Turkish government as a viral. So it was their strategy to introduce Turkey's new space program. So once again, monoliths, maybe they are simple, but they tell us a lot. Good luck in today's event.
Thank you very much, Dr. Tuck, for an interesting presentation. The first presenter that we have is Amin Omar. Amin Omar is completing his second MA in Islamic Studies with a concentration on Muslim civilization and societies. His bachelor's and first master's degrees are in history from George Mason University and George Washington University. His academic interests lie in 19th century British colonialism of the Persian and Arabian Gulf, studies of race and diaspora, and Islamic intellectual, social, and transnational history of the 19th century Middle East and North Africa. He will be presenting his paper on the limits of Islamic legalism in Saudi Arabia, and analysis of Haifa al-Mansur Wajda. Amin, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Fama, for your introduction, and what an inspiring talk by Professor Edwin-Toke. Thank you so much for that inspiration. So if you would allow me to share my presentation, I will go ahead and start. Let's see. Okay. There we go. Okay, so as Fama had mentioned, my paper is titled The Limits of Islamic Legalism. It's an analysis on Haifa al-Mansur's Wajda. The sections that I will cover is, first, I'll give an overview of the film, and I will thereby discuss my thesis, the arguments that I make, the sources I use, and the subsequent sections that follow. So Wajda was made in 2012. It's the first feature film to be shot in Saudi Arabia, and directed by its first female director, Haifa Al-Mansour. It relays the story of an adolescent female who goes through hurdles to purchase a bicycle. Along with the many social issues articulated in the film, Al-Mansour highlights the controversy of bicycle riding for females in Saudi Arabia. Wajda, who is the protagonist, and you can see in the photo here, is portrayed as a cheeky, independent-minded girl who wittingly, though naively at times, uses stratagems to navigate her conservative and patriarchal society. Despite having no money and facing discouragement from her mother, Wajda relentlessly tries to save up money to purchase a bicycle. She eventually enters her madrasa's Quran competition, wins enough money to purchase the bicycle. But upon the headmistress of the madrasa, she ends up finding out about Wajda's intention to purchase a bicycle, ends up redirecting the funds to other charitable causes. Towards the end of the film, Wajda's mother, whose worldview has been wrecked due to a disappointment in her marriage, purchases the bicycle for Wajda, encouraging her daughter to chase her aspirations beyond social dictates. Using film as a rhetorical vehicle, Al-Mansour underscores the challenges faced by women in Saudi Arabia and the dissonance between conservatism of the public sphere on the one hand and the profane predilections of people's private lives on the other. Similarly, my article seeks to tease out articulations of Islamic legalism exhibited in the film. I argue that Islamic legalism is conspicuous throughout the film and emblematic of limitations in the areas of gender, marriage, taqwa or God consciousness, ikhlas or sincerity, and al-waqi' al-ijtima'i or social reality. Often, Wahhabism is at the center in debates concerning women's limitations in Saudi Arabia. The position of women, however, reflects an interplay between religion, the state, and social customs. Women's marginalization in the public sphere or the attempt to maintain women's mobility stems from the efforts to preserve notions of the family and women's status. Since the advent of anti-colonialism and secular nationalism in the Arab world, women have become the benchmark for modernization. They are not only central to the construction of modern nations, but also embroiled in national projects. Likewise, the family has come to figure prominently in Muslim societies and Islamic legal discourse. The emphasis and theorization of these domestic categories, i.e. family and women, came as responses to Western domination, resulting in the reimagination of women as leaders of a domestic space vested with new burdens and responsibilities. Similarly, the downsizing of the extended family, Bayt al-Aliya, to nuclear households, al-Usra, has not only neutralized women's productivity, but also cut them off from extended tribal support and protection. In one scene, we find Wajda's name missing from her father's family tree, a diagram that lists its male relatives. Wajda decides to handwrite her name on a slip of paper and place it underneath her father's branch. However, the next morning, she discovers that her name was removed. Delineating and keeping a record of family lineage is a custom in the Gulf that goes back centuries. It helps determine inheritance, control of awqaf, and contract marriages by assessing parity. With the advent of state building and centralization, the construction of nasab almost completely excluded women. The introduction of royal family tree models by European travelers and missionaries preoccupied with political histories and dynasties with rare mention of women influenced Arab historians who adopted similar models into their construction of family lineages. Through this scene, Al-Mansour elicits her audience to question the thought behind the constructions of Arab genealogies and women's place within them. Because Wajda's mother is unable to have more children, her husband decides to remarry. Infertility is just one of many reasons of polygamy in Saudi Arabia. In the attempt to prevent her husband from remarrying, Wajda's mother tries adorning herself, believing it would demotivate her husband from pursuing other women. In all such cases, marriage revolves around the husband's needs, not the needs of women nor children. Cinematography allows Al-Mansour to articulate her ideal notion of an Islamic marriage that prioritizes monogamy, conjugal loyalty, and compassion. She does this by interweaving an ayat from Surah Ar-Rum into her film. The ayah denotes God establishing harmony, affection, and mercy between spouses, which Al-Mansur uses to advocate an esoteric and ethical approach to marital relationships. Wajda recognizably harbors feelings of impotence, a sentiment that is quite common among Saudi youth. Western pop culture is apparent in her taste of music and clothing. Al-Mansur signals to us that Saudi youth are not only becoming more aware of the world around them, but are also picking up habits untenable for the older generation to contain. Many Saudis who study abroad become conversant with the culture, political, and grammatical expressions of young globally minded activists, which they then mobilize back home. Despite facing barriers, Wajda and her interlocutors develop strategies to engage in activities they enjoy. In various scenes, characters utilize physical space, usually these discrete and closed-off areas, to engage in behaviors, conversation, and activities that the public domain considers reprehensible. These spaces could sometimes be the backyard of a madrasa, closed-off roads, kitchens, living rooms, balconies, or even the internet. I qualify these spaces as counter-publics, whereby women and youth construct alternative discourses outside of the official or dominant public. Various scenes in Al-Mansur's film set at Wajda's home, where we learn most about Wajda and her mother, not just who they are, but also what their physical appearance is. The joyriding scene in the city of Jeddah, a term to denote drifting, speeding, and performing all sorts of stunts with cars, is another counterpublic that displays forms of social opposition. Al-Mansur is acutely aware of the cultural and religious dimensions she recreates in her film. Although she recognizes that conservative Saudis would probably not appreciate her film, she is optimistic that they will stimulate robust conversation. To many, however, Al-Mansur and her film are part of Saudi Arabia's public relations campaign, whereby educated women are mobilized to project an image of cosmopolitan modernity. Women have been granted new capabilities and are gradually replacing the religious establishment in defining the roles and status of women in the region. The paradox, however, is that while Saudi Arabia has loosened its restrictions on women's civil liberties, it has simultaneously increased suppression of political dissidents. Critics have accused Al-Mansur of silence on the role of the states and find that she too simplistically blames culture and society without considering the power with which the state yields in reinforcing discriminatory laws. It is important to reflect on what kind of agency artists have in the kingdom. Although their work may sometimes align with the regime's economic and political interests, they are not necessarily part of the elites and can articulate the feelings and experiences of the masses below. The satirical music video, Hawajis, translated to Concerns, released in 2016, played a crucial role in the debate on women driving in Saudi Arabia, receiving millions of views on YouTube and extensive international coverage. Almost immediately after the release of Hawajis, King Salman lifted the restriction on women driving. Through artistic, cinematic, and literary formulations, activists can articulate social issues that are not visible in more official outlets, such as press or participatory politics. Although the Saudi regime co-opt artists and filmmakers in ways that limits their work to social critique without mention of existing power structures, we ought to refrain from dichotomous interpretations where they can be either opposition or capitulation. Al-Mansur and artists of her kind do not see their work as instigating political reform, more so than they see it as starting a conversation that's at home with the culture and religious values of society. Put simply, they operate within a limited agency whose body of work is meant to serve a form of limited political activism. To conclude, it's been my objective to outline how Islamic legalism in Saudi Arabia operate through a cooperation of the states, Islamic legislative bodies, and cultural customs. This relationship coalesces in rules that elevate patriarchal structures while relegating women to the private sphere. In turn, women develop counter narratives through the utilization of space. While women are at the center of Al-Mansur's story, her film resonates with Saudi youth whose motivations and sensibilities contrast their environment. Though several social changes have recently come underway in the region, Al-Mansour's film depicts issues that are still ongoing. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Amin, for that wonderful presentation. So now we will move to Q&A. So if anyone has any questions, please feel free to submit those questions in the Q&A box at the bottom right corner. So we do have one question. So the first question is, what is the relevance of the niqabi women that were included in your presentation, Amin?
Okay, yeah, that's the niqabis who are in the amusement park playing bumper cars. Okay, so there's two illustrations of niqabis, one of which is actually a photograph by the artists whose name is Arwa al-Naimi. And what she used, this was actually a photograph that you can kind of say went viral some years back. And the interesting fact about it is that it sort of illustrates a paradox, you can say, that although you have women who are dressed in these dark and gloomy veils, they are still nonetheless able to go to amusement parks and have a good time. And it sort of contrasts, like it puts into question like this contrast, or like this idea that women in Saudi Arabia kind of, live on the outskirts of society and are kind of not necessarily involved, or not having a good time. It upsets that a little bit. It complicates that, and so the image, the photograph, gotten a lot of you could say interesting. It kind of troubled people's paradigm in how they observe women in the region, especially women who are dressed in that sort. Now there's another picture, and it kind of does the same thing. You see women who are skateboarding, and this is the music video Hawajis back in 2016, and it also kind of speaks to this notion of women being sort of docile in a sense that they are not willing to, or they're willing to just, be comfortable with the situation, with them not being able to drive. And you got to remember, like, these illustrations were before the recent policy that was lifted on women driving. And so these were like important drivers that had allowed for, or people would like to say, had allowed for that new policy to go into play.
Thank you very much, Amin. Thank you. We have another question from Noor. Can you speak more about how your analysis of Wajda reveals the limits of Islamic legalism?
So here's the thing. Al-Mansour, she doesn't consider herself less of a Muslim because of things that she disagrees with, whether it be, their religious establishment, whether it be certain fatwa that prevents women from driving. She doesn't see herself as less of a Muslim. So the question then comes, to what extent do, fatwa that we now see are kind of being rescinded? To what extent does that capture, let's say, morality? And there's this, we sort of take for granted that, I don't want to say we, but there's a notion that usually through fiqh, you arrive to a sort of ethical inference. And Al-Mansour this film kind of questions that. She tries to provide a way in which you can see, like, let's say, for instance, the whole dilemma that Wajda's, I don't know if anyone here actually watched the movie, but if you watch it, you'll see that Wajda's mother sort of goes through a dilemma. The dilemma being that, she's worried about losing her husband to, a second wife. And so Al-Mansur, what she's doing is she's trying to, problematize this whole idea of, she's not trying to problematize, it doesn't seem that she's trying to problematize things that are, essential to Islam more so than people's choice, and doing things that may be permissible, that may be legally permissible at the cost of what may be ethical. And usually those things she tries to show are conflated, that what is permissible legally is always going to be equal to what is ethical. And I think she sort of, she problematizes that a bit.
Thank you very much, Amin, for answering those questions for us. Just one more question. Has Al-Mansur been involved in any other projects since Wajda?
She has 2 years back, I would say, 2019, there has been a film called The Perfect Candidate. And it's also, you could say, it expands on, this idea of women's empowerment through, instead of, bicycle riding, instead of, looking at The Perfect Candidate, instead of sort of looking at, how women navigate society, it shows how women navigate their way through politics. So it goes into how, what a woman's role is in the political dimension, what's the stakes involved there, and that sort of things. Yeah.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the wonderful presentation and answering all of our questions.
Thank you.
Thank you. So now we will move on to our next presenter, Abdul Ahad Lo. Abdul Ahad Lo is a writer and researcher in authentic Islamic thought, jurisprudence, and Sufism, and interested in issues of reform, renewal, and human renaissance. He is class of 2021 student for the master's program in Islamic studies with a specialization in contemporary Quranic studies. He received his bachelor's degree in Sharia from the University of Al-Qarawiyyin in Fez, Morocco. He has a hafid of the Holy Quran and an active member of several cultural and social associations, including the International Federation of Arabic Language. Today, Abdul, who will present in Arabic, discusses the theory of tolerance from the perspective of Quranic diplomacy. Abdul, the floor is first.
Thank you so much, Homer. Sorry for somebody because I speak in Arabic. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. فأوجه إليكم أزكى تحية وأطيبها، وأقدم في هذه الأمسية المباركة ورقة تتعلق بالتسامح من منظور الدبلوماسية القرآنية. لا شك أنكم جميعا تعرفون أن التسامح أو العالم المعاصر يشهد مظاهر عديدة من التطرف وحرب الأيديولوجيات وكوارث شنيعة نتيجة العنف والتعصب والنزاع في الماديات. ولهذا السبب اهتمت المنظمات والجمعيات والمؤسسات بالتسامح كحل سلمي وحيد لهذه الحروب وهذه النزاعات. ولكن من منظور آخر هنالك إهمال كبير أو إغفال لاستجلاء نظرية التسامح من منظور القرآن الكريم. هنالك الكثير ممن اهتم بالتسامح في القرآن، لكن في الحقيقة هنالك نوع من الإسقاط للمفاهيم الأخرى على الخطاب القرآني، وأهمية هذه الدراسة ستتبلور في محاولته إبراز التسامح من منظور القرآن الكريم. والدراسة أو العرض سيكون يعني من مقدمة ومبحثان رئيسيان وقاتمة. في المقدمة تحدثنا عن الإشكالية وأهداف الدراسة والدراسات السابقة ومنهج الدراسة، وأبرزنا أهمية هذه الدراسة أو أهداف هذه الدراسة، وأهدافها تتبلور في إبراز طبيعة التسامح الذي يقدمه القرآن الكريم، إبراز حقيقة التسامح وآلياته من منظور الدبلوماسية القرآنية، بيان مميزات التسامح القرآني مقارنة بالمرجعيات الأولى أو الأخرى. فيما يتعلق بصلب الموضوع وهو المحاور، فقسمنا البحث إلى محورين أساسيين. في المحور الأول تحدثنا عن مفهوم التسامح وأهميته، وفي المحور الثاني التسامح من منظور القرآن الكريم الذي هو لب الموضوع. فيما يتعلق بالتعريف التسامح، فحاولنا تعريفه من خلال التطرق للمعنى الوضعي والمعنى السياقي. فلاحظنا أن التسامح من معنى الوضعي يحيل كما يشير علماء اللغة إلى السهولة، يعني الملاينة في المعاملة. وهذا المعنى الموجود في الجذر اللغوي مهم لأننا نستطيع من خلاله أن نستجلي التسامح أو نوعية التسامح الذي قدمه القرآن الكريم. هذا فيما يتعلق بالمعنى الوضعي. أما ما يتعلق بالمعنى السياقي فهنالك تعاريف عديدة، منها التعريف الذي ذكره أبو الأعلى المودودي بأن التسامح معناه أن نتحمل عقائد غيرنا وأعمالهم على كونها باطلة في نظرنا، يعني أن نتحمل عقائد الغير. هذا التعريف فيه لمحة عن الجانب الديني أو العقدي كما تلاحظون. وهنالك تعاريف أخرى، منها هذا التعريف الذي يذكره البعض، وهو أنه المساكنة والتعايش في إطار رؤية إسلامية تحترم حق الآخر في الرأي والعقيدة والفكر. وهنالك تعريف يعني ذكره منظمة اليونسكو سنة 1995، عرفت هذه المنظمة التسامح بأنه الاحترام والقبول والتقدير للتنوع الثري لثقافات عالمنا ولأشكال التعبير والصفات الإنسانية. فنلاحظ أن هذا التعريف يكون أشمل من التعريف السابق أو التعريفين السابقين، لأن هنالك تقدير للعنصر البشري بغض النظر عن الصفات الإنسانية وبغض النظر عن الجانب الديني الذي ذكره أبو الأعلى المودودي مثلا. هذا فيما يتعلق يعني كتقديم بسيط للتسامح حسب ما عرفه بعض الجهات. في المحور التابع تحدثنا عن أهم أنواع التسامح ومجالاته، فقسمناها إلى عنصر يكون فيه التسامح، يعني مجال يكون فيه التسامح باختيار الشخص، وهذا يتناول الدين والفكر والتصرف الفعلي من الإنسان. والنوع الآخر هو التسامح الذي يكون فيما لا دخل فيه للاختيار الإنسان، سواء من اللون البشرة أو العرق أو الجنس أو بلد الأصلي أو حتى الأصول الميلادية. بعد ذلك تطرقنا إلى أهمية التسامح، ولا شك أنكم تعرفون أن الاختلاف بين البشر شيء طبيعي ومقصد رباني، وهذا بدليل الآيات القرآنية الكثيرة. ولا شك أن الاختلاف إذا لم يتم توظيفه إيجابيا لا شك أنه سيؤدي إلى انقسامات وتعددات مذهبية، ومن ثم يأتي التسامح بمثابة الحل السلمي الوحيد لحل المشكلات الناجمة من هذا الاختلاف الطبيعي. ولهذا اهتم المنظمات العالمية بما فيها منظمة الأمم المتحدة بترسيخ مبادئ التسامح، وجعل التسامح ضمن المواد الأساسية في الإعلان العالمي لحقوق الإنسان. كما أن التسامح حسب ما نلاحظ نجد أن ظهوره في الغرب كان نتيجة الحروب والنزاعات التي وقعت في الغرب بعد القرون الوسطى. هذا كتمهيد لمعرفة أهمية التسامح. وركزنا في هذا المحور الثاني الذي هو الأهم عن التسامح من منظور القرآن الكريم، واخترنا آية تمثل لب القرآن الكريم، وهي قوله تعالى: خذ العفو وأمر بالعرف وأعرض عن الجاهلين. فهي آية كريمة وعظيمة تضمنت كما يقول المفسرون جميع المكارم الأخلاق وقواعد الشريعة، وهي أجمع آية لمكارم الأخلاق. وتعرفون أن الأخلاق إما أخلاق دينية وإما أخلاق اجتماعية، والتي هي الأخلاق بين الإنسان مع أخيه. ولا شك أن هذه الآية فيه تأسيس لمبادئ الأخلاق الاجتماعية، وفيه تأسيس أيضا لهذا التسامح. ووجه جمع هذه الآية للتصرفات الأخلاقية أننا نلاحظ أن التصرف من الإنسان إما أن يكون عفوا عن ظلم، وهذا هو المقصود من قوله تعالى: خذ العفو، وإما أن يكون إعراضا عن العمل غير اللائق، وهذا هو المقصود من قوله تعالى: وأعرض عن الجاهلين، وإما أن يكون طلب تحصيل فضيلة، وهذا هو المراد من قوله تعالى: وأعرض عن الجاهلين. فلاحظنا بعد دراسة طويلة أن العفو في هذه الآية هي الكلمة المفتاحية لبلورة التسامح القرآني، وذلك حسب المعنى الوضعي لكل من الكلمتين. فالعفو تأتي بمعنى السمح والسهل، ووردت في آيات كثيرة فسرت بهذا المفهوم، إضافة إلى أن يعني كلمة العفو في آية نفسها فسرت بما سهل من أخلاق الناس، يعني مما يشير إلى العلاقة الوطيدة بين التسامح والعفو، ومما يشير أيضا إلى أن العفو هي الكلمة المفتاحية للتسامح القرآني. لكننا آثرنا تأسيس الرؤية القرآنية للتسامح من منظور الآية بالأوامر الثلاثة، يعني بالأخذ بالعفو والأمر بالعرف والإعراض عن الجاهل، لأننا نرى أن مبدأ التسامح يسعى إلى هدف واحد، وهو تحصيل حسن المعاشرة. ولا شك أن تحصيل ذلك إنما يكون بنظرة متكاملة لا بنظرة تجزئية. وبعد تحليل ودراسة توصلنا إلى أن الرؤية القرآنية للتسامح يمكن استخلاصها بأن التسامح القرآني يقوم على 3 ركائز. الركيزة الأولى هي التساهل في الحقوق الشخصية باحترام الآخر وتقديم مصلحته على مصلحتك. والثاني هو التعامل مع المخالف باعترافه وقبوله أيا كان، وهو ما يفضي إلى إيصال الخير إليه عن طريق الأمر بالعرف. والركيزة الثالثة هي الإعراض عما يصدر عن السفيه من الهوات بالتساهل في اعتدائه، وهو المراد تحقيقه في الإعراض عن الجاهل. وأنتم تلاحظون أن هذه الآية إذا كانت تمثل لب الآيات القرآنية وقلب الشريعة كما يذكر المفسرون، فإن ذلك يعني أن التسامح هي قيمة مركزية في الخطاب القرآني. وبعد أن ذكرنا أن أو رؤية القرآن للتسامح بصورة موجزة، فنلاحظ أن القرآن الكريم يستخدم آليات متعددة لترسيخ التسامح، ومن هذه الآلية إلقاء الفوارق الطبقية. فالقرآن الكريم هنا تعامل معاملة غريبة وطريفة مع الاختلاف، فهو قام باعتبار الأوصاف الجبلية أوصافا طردية بعبارة الفقهاء كما يمكن أن يقال، وجعل المعيار وصفا آخر داخليا وهو التقوى، وذلك من قوله تعالى إن أكرمكم عند الله أتقاكم. ثم جعل هذا
أستاذ
الاختلاف.
عبدول، فقط للتذكير يعني وقتكم هو 10 دقائق وتجاوزتم الوقت، فلو سمحتم يعني في دقيقة يعني شكرا.
نعم. إذن هذه هي الآليات يعني الأساسية التي استخدمها القرآن: إلقاء الفوارق الطبقية، مشروعية الحوار، وترسيخ مبدأ الصبر باعتباره آلية مهمة. وذلك ما جعل التسامح القرآني بغض النظر عن كونه تصرفا فهي تمثل عبادة كثيرة. وهنالك يعني مميزات كثيرة للتسامح القرآني، منها المعالجة من الأصل والارتباط بعبادة الله والشمولية والأصالة والفعالية إلى غير ذلك مما يعني يتضمنه التسامح من منظور القرآن الكريم. ونعتذر عن هذه الإطالة، ففي الحقيقة هي إضاءات أكثر مما هي محاضرة. والسلام عليكم وشكرا على حسن الاستماع.
شكرا جزيلا أخ عبد الأحد. وصلتنا بعض الأسئلة من طرف الحضور الكريم، بالتحديد سؤالين، فلو تسمح وتتكرم أود أن أقرأ عليكم هذه الأسئلة ولو تتكرمون بالإجابة. إذن السؤال الأول هو التالي: ما جوهر الخلاف بين التسامح من المنظور القرآني الذي قدمتم وبين التسامح كما تعرفه بعض المنظمات العالمية مثل تعريف اليونسكو الذي أشرتم إليه؟
صحيح، سؤال مهم. فأظن أن التسامح الذي قدمه القرآن الكريم يختلف بصورة جذرية عن التسامح الذي تراه المنظمات مثل تعريف اليونسكو، لأن القرآن الكريم في تعريفه للتسامح قدم رؤية متكاملة، ولأن القرآن الكريم نظر أيضا إلى التسامح باعتباره عبادة. فنلاحظ في تعريف اليونسكو أن التسامح هنالك فقط يقتصر على القبول والاحترام، أما في التسامح القرآني فهنالك أمر بالعرف. فهذا يحيل إلى أن التسامح القرآني ليس فقط إيمانيا يعني داخليا فحسب، وإنما هو تأثير في الآخر. هذا هو جوهر مميزات التسامح القرآني.
شكرا جزيلا. السؤال التالي: هل تعتقد أن هناك دورا للدبلوماسية القرآنية في حل القضايا السياسية العالمية، وكيف يمكننا تطبيقه؟
صحيح، لا شك أن هذه الرؤية القرآنية للتسامح يمكن أن يساهم في حل النزاعات العالمية بصورة كبيرة. ويعني ما قامت به مثلا المنظمة الأمم المتحدة يعني ترسيخ التسامح حتى لحل يعني بعض نزاعات بعض الدول، هذا دليل على أن التسامح يعني يمكن أن يساهم في حل النزاعات. ونرى أن التسامح الذي يقدمه القرآن الكريم يعني أنسب لذلك، خاصة أنه تسامح يعالج الأمور من أصلها. ونرى أن تطبيق هذا التسامح يكون بتأسيس منظمات تتبنى التسامح بواسطة أو بهذه الرؤية التي قدمها القرآن الكريم، والتشجيع أيضا على البحوث التي تقدم على التسامح القرآني. يعني هنالك رؤية قرآنية واضحة، ونرى أنها يعني ذات فعالية في حل النزاعات. فقد يكفي التطبيق، والتطبيق موجه إلى الجهات من المنظمات والمؤسسات الدولية.
شكرا جزيلا. السؤال التالي والأخير: إلى أي مدى يمكن للتسامح القرآني أن يساهم في حل النزاعات العالمية؟
صحيح، يعني سؤال ربما أجبنا عنه يعني ضمنيا. فالتسامح القرآني كما ذكرت يتميز بالفعالية والأصالة. مساهمته في حل هذه النزاعات سيتم بواسطة الجهات، يعني وهنالك وهنا يأتي دور المؤسسات الإسلامية خاصة، فعليهم أن يقدموا التسامح وفق هذه الرؤية القرآنية للكون، يعني لا يقتصرون فقط على نظرية الإسقاط التي نلاحظه يعني من الكثير، حيث يسقطون التسامح يعني وفق مثلا المفاهيم الغربية على الخطاب القرآني. نحن نريد تأسيس نظرة قرآنية متكاملة، وأظن أن مساهمة القرآن الكريم في حل ذلك سيتم أولا ببلورة الرؤية القرآنية أولا، ثم تقديم هذه الرؤية للكون بما فيها المؤسسات وبما فيها أيضا المنظمات، وأيضا أن يكون كل إنسان يعني يحاول أن يقدم هذه الرؤية القرآنية بتصرفه هو، يعني الإصلاح من تحت كما يقال. نعم.
شكرا جزيلا وجزاكم الله ألف خير. ننتقل الآن إلى بقية البرنامج. So we can move actually Fama to the next presenter, please. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. And thank you very much, Abdulahad, for your presentation. The next presenter is Zahra Hazrachi. Zahra is currently pursuing her master's in Islamic studies with a specialization in contemporary fiqh. She received her bachelor's degree in Islamic studies from Mount Holyoke College in the United States, as well as a BA in Sharia from Al-Azhar University in Egypt. Zahra's research interests include Islamic legal theory, contemporary fiqh issues, gender studies, and the scholarship of women in Islam. Zahra will be presenting her paper on To Report or Not to Report, a school counselor's ethical dilemma concerning child abuse. Zahra, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Fama. Assalamu alaikum. Okay. So this presentation is about a research question that I had for a while, and it's about a topic that many clinicians and counselors in the US who are Muslim face. And so I attempted to address this ethical dilemma in this paper, and it's titled To Report or Not to Report, a School Counselor's Ethical Dilemma Concerning Child Abuse. So we talk about the introduction to the dilemma and the dilemma itself, the elements in it, the idea of beating as a form of discipline, the legal consequences, and finally, the Islamic juristic perspective. So the case vignette is that there is a Muslim counselor working in the US, and she was counseling a Muslim child who she discovered was being beaten at home. And in the US, counselors are mandatory reporters, but she hesitates to report because she fears that the child may be removed from their home. And also, if she doesn't report, there are legal repercussions, and also she fears for her reputation. So that's briefly what the background of this dilemma is. Now, conceptualizing the dilemma, there are three main parts. One is disciplining children. Is beating an effective tool in disciplining children, Islamically and ethically? And then the legal consequences. What is the case for mandatory reporters? And the Islamic juristic perspective can be looked at, this dilemma can be looked at based on the maqasid al-Sharia, or the higher objectives of the Sharia, in the preservation of the 5 objectives and the ranking between them. So first of all, beating as a form of discipline, is it an effective tool or not? So first we have to clarify that child abuse is serious physical injury that is inflicted intentionally. So that is what constitutes child abuse. And we look at that from the Islamic perspective as well as the universal ethical perspective. Now, from the Islamic perspective, there are numerous prophetic traditions that demonstrate showing kindness and having mercy towards children. One of them is that the Prophet ﷺ said, and this applies in general, that there should be neither harming nor reciprocating harm. Now, classical scholars like Abu al-Hasan al-Qabisi and al-Ghazali, Ibn Khaldun, all of them also discussed the idea of corporal punishment or beating as a form of discipline and discouraged it. Some of them even stated that it often has adverse effects, and so the better option is to treat children with And in terms of contemporary scholars, also Al-Azhar University, in cooperation with UNICEF, published a book about raising children in which they also discussed that it is not Islamically permissible to harm children physically or psychologically. So that's with regards to the Islamic perspective. With regards to the universal ethical perspective, there are numerous studies that have indicated that corporal punishment is actually ineffective. And there are better ways of discipline. Also, severe beating is universally denounced as violating a principle that inflicting harm on anyone is unethical. And so the effects of that is that children often end up with a lot of mental health issues, behavior problems, and other things. And extreme forms can actually even cause permanent changes in the brain, damage, biochemical changes, structural changes. So from both of these perspectives, it's clear that beating is inherently bad. Now we come to the legal consequences. So school counselors are mandatory reporters of child abuse. And so if they do not report, they can face fines, they can be imprisoned, and they can also face civil lawsuits, have to go to court and such things. However, despite that, they still find themselves in a dilemma and hesitate to report because of feelings of guilt or that they're going to break up a home. In this case, that the boy may be removed from his family, his other siblings may also be removed. Cultural differences, they understand that culturally there's different understandings of what constitutes abuse or discipline, also a lack of training. So all of these lead to a traumatic experience for the counselor themselves. And despite that, they don't have a choice. They have to report. And so when they do that, the Child Protection Services come and they start an investigation, which leads to either the removal of the child, which may be temporary, or it may even be permanent. And regardless, that leads to a relationship damage between the child and the counselor. So that's with regard to the legal aspect. We move on to the Islamic juristic perspective. Now, in this dilemma in the Islamic juristic perspective can be analyzed in light of the maqasid sharia, or the higher objectives of the sharia, and those seek to preserve the 5 essentials, which are faith, life, intellect, lineage, and wealth. In that order of importance is how the scholars rank them, and this is the order that was presented by Imam al-Ghazali. Now, faith takes priority. And faith is preserved by an Islamic upbringing in this circumstance. So if the child was to be removed, they would no longer, and placed into a non-Muslim foster home, they would no longer know their faith. In terms of life, that no physical harm should be inflicted. So that is how the life would be preserved. Intellect, physical and psychological trauma should be avoided. And with regards to lineage, the child's parent connection would be lost if the child were to be removed and placed in a different home on a permanent basis. So this is how these essentials are preserved. They're also preserved by enjoining good and forbidding evil, which is a duty that is incumbent upon all Muslims. And so in this case, the counselor has a duty to do that and advise the child's parents. Now, this is the dilemma. How should the counselor act? Because she's torn between these different circumstances. So she has two options. Option one is to report, and by doing that, she would be fulfilling the legal requirements. However, she would also be enjoining good and forbidding evil because, as we mentioned, child abuse is forbidden, and it would be for the betterment, hopefully, for the emotional and physical well-being of the child. However, the faith, intellect, lineage of the child are at stake if they are removed from home, especially if that is a permanent removal. Lastly, they face emotional turmoil of guilt. She may feel that she's responsible if the child is removed on a permanent basis and placed in a non-Muslim home. They may lose their faith, and she would be held accountable before God for that. And also, she feels for her reputation being from a Muslim community where she knows his parents in the mosque as well. So those are the elements or the outcomes of reporting. Now, if she chooses not to report, the legal consequences remain. Faith takes precedence, meaning that she gives priority to him maintaining his faith by being at home. However, the life and intellect are still at stake. The lineage would also be preserved if he were to remain in his home. And lastly, she still has a moral obligation regardless to protect and try and lessen the harm on the child. So it's a very complicated situation, and in a situation such as this, there's a lot of different pros and cons as to what the best choice of action may be. One option would be to advise the child's parents and threaten them that what they're doing is Islamically and ethically unacceptable, and it may be enough in having them stop. And what we can do in this situation is apply the Islamic legal maxim, which is that in the presence of two harms or evils, the one whose damage is greater is avoided by committing the lesser harm. So in that sense, not reporting would probably result in less harm, as long as she still does her duty and confronts the parents and threatens them that if they do not stop, then she will take legal action. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Zahra. Thank you very much for that wonderful presentation. So now we will move to the Q&A portion. If anyone has any questions, just a reminder, you can submit the question in the question box at the bottom right corner. Just to start us off, I do have one question. So the mechanism for reporting is different from country to country, right? So then what constitutes as child abuse varies in different cultures and societies. So how can religious leaders play a role in helping mitigate the prevalence of child abuse?
That's actually a really important question because the legal and the cultural aspects vary, it's critical that the religious leaders educate the public that child abuse is Islamically unacceptable. And they should highlight and emphasize the prophetic example that the Prophet ﷺ, he never beat anyone and he only showed kindness and mercy to children. And there's one report where Aisha radiallahu anha reports that Bedouins came to the Prophet ﷺ and they asked him, "Do you kiss your children?" And he said, "Yes." And they said, "We don't kiss our children." And he said, "Well, what can I do if Allah has deprived you of mercy?" So he was always so merciful. And so religious leaders need to take on that role and explain to people that harm is not Islamically acceptable.
Thank you so much. Yeah, that's a wonderful answer. Um, Second question is, would such a dilemma also apply to other crimes, such as, for instance, witnessing thievery? What if capturing the criminal will leave an entire family of innocents destitute? And would the lesser harm be considered not reporting?
Well, see, that's a very different circumstance because that has to do with the juristic system. And so it falls within the judiciary system, and it's not a matter of a counselor who's making a decision in her office. And with regards to other crimes, it really depends on what that crime would be. So if it's a crime that has a prescribed punishment, then there is not room for there's already a prescribed punishment, so there's not room for weighing benefits and harms. However, there are rules and regulations that need to be upheld. However, if it's a different type of crime, it still would depend, because when the rights of other people are involved, it doesn't give an individual a right to make a decision. These are all things that would be under the judicial system of wherever this would be happening. And Islamically, the juristic system is, it has specific requirements for all of these different circumstances. And so with regards to testifying, if a person is asked to testify, then they have to tell the truth. So as long as there is a prescribed punishment for a crime, there doesn't leave room for looking at pros and cons or the benefits and the harms. But in other situations, it may. So it's not like you can't always apply this principle.
I see, I see. Thank you so much, Sada. Thank you so
Thank you.
much.
Thank you.
So if there aren't any more questions for Zahra, we will move on to our next presenter. Adam Aloa is currently a student of the master's program in Islamic Studies with a concentration in comparative religion. He graduated from the International Islamic University Malaysia. His research interests revolve around Muslim-Christian relations, interfaith mediation strategies, religious tolerance and peace building, interreligious coexistence, interfaith dialogue, religion, and peace. And so today he will be presenting on Islamophobia, a new phenomenon or part of a continuum. Okay. Welcome, Adam, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Farmer, for the kind words. So first of all, I'm very honored and delighted to be part of this conference today, and it's a great pleasure to meet you all. Yeah. So allow me to share my slides. So today I'll be discussing one of the most important global issues of the modern time, and it's going to be about Islamophobia. What we seek to, what I want to discuss in this conference today is about the question of whether or not Islamophobia is a new phenomenon in the history of ideas, or a reemergence of anti-Muslim sentiments that have existed throughout history. I'm Adam Aloa, like Farmer said. I'm going to be presenting this topic today. So following 9/11 and other horrific acts of terrorism purportedly carried out in the name of Islam, anti-Muslim, contemporary anti-Muslim rhetoric has been ever more recurrent and increasingly prevalent across public and private space. And according to what was written by Anne and Kotha in the National Review magazine, this was immediately after 9/11, and she said, "We should invade their countries, kill their leaders, and convert them to Christianity." And this session was also substantiated by Geert Wilders, who also wrote that Islam is something we can't afford anymore in the Netherlands, and want the fascist Quran banned. And then Franklin Graham also said, Islam has attacked us. The God of Islam is not the same God. Islam is a very evil religion. So statistics and attitudes documented by a number of renowned research institutes all point towards an alarming increase in Islamophobic acts in the West. For example, in 2002, the EUMC report, the European Monitoring Center on Racism and Xenophobia, documented an increased and widespread Islamophobia in Europe. And in 2004 as well, the Runnymede report in the UK also documented that Islamophobia is fast becoming a pervasive feature of the British society. The same thing in the recent European survey of Islamophobia that shows that nearly 4 in 10 people, Muslims and Islam. The same thing in the Gallup report of 2014 and 2016 that says that Americans are reported to be holding the kind of negative feelings or prejudices against people or groups that orient around the Islamic tradition. So according to the table that is on my screen, it shows that 82%, this is by from Pew Research Institute, and it shows that 82% of Muslims, 82% of Americans agree to subjecting Muslim to some kind of discrimination, which is a bit alarming. So this is to say that institutional suspicion of Muslims, or those perceived to be Muslims, has escalated to an epidemic proportion, and there's no better time in history to discuss Islamophobia or anti-Muslim sentiment than now. So the outline of this presentation is going to follow the sequence. I'll talk about contemporary Islamophobia, and then we look into history, what history has to offer, continuities and discontinuities, basically from the medieval period to modern period. We talk about dialogue, the role of dialogue as a panacea in solving the problem and helping us to prevent Islamophobia using Lederer's pyramid of action, and then we talk about the theology of love briefly. So it would be a misconception to say that Islamophobia began with 9/11, because before Islamophobia, the stage was already set for discriminatory attitude against Muslims. And when we talk about in recent history, the earliest root of Islamophobia that we can find can be traced back to the post-Reformation period in Europe, the Age of Enlightenment to the 18th century, where Islam was viewed or perceived from an entirely different context compared to the Middle Ages. And this is because in the Middle Ages, the concept of secularism was non-existent. That is, religion and state was a single entity. In Western Christendom, the Pope was the head of government and the head of state. And the same thing in Arabia, Muslim Arabs, the Khalifa is the head of government and the spiritual head of religion as well. So that is to say that religion was a worldview. It cannot be separated. It dictates the life of the people then. Rather than now, especially during the Enlightenment period, where the concept of secularism was being institutionalized, and then religion has taken a back foot in the sense that things are now viewed from a secular point of view, from a purely rational point of view. So the Islam ceased to be viewed from through the lenses of religion, and then it became to be viewed from a civilizational and cultural aspect of it, from a cultural perspective. And this period, we talk about Enlightenment scholars such as Voltaire, such as Thomas Hobbes, John Locke, and others who try to contextualize Islam from a purely Western perspective or from a purely secularized perspective, taking away the theological or religious aspect of it. So with the surge in interest in Islamic civilization during the Age of Enlightenment, many European aristocracy and wealthy elite also tried to travel to the Muslim world to experience Muslim culture firsthand. So the travelogue of these travelers, according to Edward Said, became increasingly popular in European society, and it formed a sizable number of reports that set the stage for what became known as the Orientalist tradition. So these people are what started what became known as the Orientalist tradition, people that traveled to the Muslim world to perceive or to observe Islam from a Western or secular perspective, and giving a kind of negative representation of Islam, because it's been viewed from a kind of a westernized perspective. So with the populist interest in Islamic tradition also coincide with the academic inquiry, but the academic inquiry we're talking about here is not only motivated by the intellectual curiosity. This time it's been driven by politics, economy, and militaristic concern. That is to say that this was the time that Europe was expanding, consolidating lands and territories across Africa and Asia, and they're trying to project that kind of Western and secular perspective and to influence them with this kind of ideology. So this period saw a new understanding of Islam being circulated, premised on a rationalized basis and power as well. So this group of academicians who Edward Said referred to as Orientalists, and this oversaw the dissemination of information that present Islam and the Muslim world as an inferior civilization, a backward group of individuals that are irrational violent, barbaric, and with no single regard for human life. So the pessimistic representation of the Muslim world during the shared by the Orientalists and during the colonial period informs the dichotomous relationship of Islam and the West. And by the end of World War II, conditions were already ripe for discriminatory behaviors towards Muslims in and outside of Europe and America. Thirdly, we'll talk about the Reformation that happened in 1979, the one of Ayatollah Khomeini, the overthrow of the Pahlavi dynasty. So this revolution will also, reinforce the existing fear of Muslims that were already, in circulation. And the one that scared the West the most was when 3,000 Iranian students went to the American embassy to attack them and then, try to banish all the Americans that were living in Iran. So this was also one of the reasons that the Islamophobia that is currently existent in the contemporary period was strengthened. And lastly is the Rushdie's affair. This was in the late 1980s. Salman Rushdie published a book. Salman Rushdie published a book titled Satanic Verses. And the idea behind the book was that the revelation that Prophet Muhammad received was did not come from God himself. It was actually initiated by Satan. So this was considered blasphemy by Muslims. And then Ayatollah Khomeini released a fatwa that says that Salman Rushdie must be killed. So all this kind of the collection of these four points informs the existing fear of Muslims that is already in circulation now. And this event and few others reified the existing fear and mistrust of Muslims and Islam, the culmination of which led to the neologism Islamophobia. So Islamophobia is a really difficult term to define. In terms of its origin, it has been heavily contested in academia and attracted divergent views. But actually, the application and the relevance of the neologism Islamophobia has also been contested in academia as well. But the Runnymede report gave it its first definition and its first socio-political discursive resonance in 1979. And it was defined as the dread, hatred, and hostility towards Islam and Muslims perpetuated by a series of closed views that imply and attribute negative and derogatory stereotypes and beliefs to Muslims. Closed views here means that the perception of Muslims as being violent or barbaric is extended to all the Muslim population and not to a significant minority. So this term became adopted by the media, NGOs, political analysts, and the people at large to label a reality that contextualizes Islam and Muslims as object of aversion, irrational, and barbaric in the contemporary liberal world. And with the occurrence of 9/11, 7/7, and the recent Salman Party's assassination in France, the idea of Islamophobia become very strong and reinforced in the Western consciousness. Going ahead. So going back to history, this is where we want to talk about.
Hi, Adam.
Yeah.
So sorry. Just a quick 10-minute time check. So if we can move on to the Q&A as you wrap up, that would be great.
Yeah,
Thank you.
Just a minute. So looking back in history, we see that the term Islamophobia has a root in history as well, because when we go back to the Middle Ages, we see a lot of representation of Islam that presented them as being barbaric, as being violent, has been untamed based. And even in Al-Kindi says Islam is a warlike religion. John of Damascus says that Islam is a deceptive superstition. Theophanes also say that Muhammad is suffering from epilepsy, and other representation of Islam like that informs the current representation of the Muslim world as being violent. And during the Crusade, the Reformation period, Enlightenment period, and Orientalist, and even in contemporary period, this kind of understanding the negative perception of Islam or being reinforced and reified stronger and stronger. And these are what informs why the Muslims in general are being persecuted for no reason. So now we go to the last part of the discussion. How can Islamophobia be prevented? What can we do to prevent Islamophobia? And this time we're trying to look at how dialogue can help us as a panacea. Paul Adler developed an integrated approach to dialogue in his book, and it shows how we can establish dialogue from the top, from 3 levels of the population, from the top, the middle range leadership, and the grassroots leadership. This way, we integrate all the members of the community, including the political analysts, the media, and the religious scholars. They come together and discuss, and they try to find ways to solve the situation. Another paradigm is the nested paradigm that seeks to develop a way by which the problem of Islamophobia can be resolved from a broader and a more systemic perspective, rather than treating one issue after the other. So yeah. So in conclusion, the conclusion is that what we need to do to end Islamophobia is for us to come together. The solution can not only be derived from the religious perspective or theological perspective, because this is an issue that touches all aspects of life. So socio-political analysts, economists, and everyone needs to come together. And this is how the problem of Islamophobia can be prevented or solved completely in the contemporary period. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Adam, for your wonderful presentation. So now we're moving on to the Q&A portion. So the first question is, in the wake of what hijabi Muslims across the Western world, like France, go through, be it verbal or physical abuse due to discrimination and Islamophobia, will it be better for them to drop their hijabs or continue to wear them even in the face of possible threats to their life in the name of keeping to their Islamic ideals? Oh, that's an interesting question.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. Personally, I would say that, at the expense of life, of losing one's life, I'll say that that comes first. We need to protect our life first before religion. But when you look at it from another perspective, you see that the women are when we talk about the expression of Islam, presenting Islam, women are when you see a Muslim woman, you immediately know that this is a Muslim woman. So those kind of things help us in kind of presenting Islam in much more peaceful fashion. I'll give you an example. Imagine an hijabi sister in a kind of university, graduated with first class and stuff like that. So those kind of images also present Islam in a way that shows that Islam is not a backward religion. We're actually very active in intellectual discourse. We're active in education. We're active in all this kind of. So taking the hijab off I don't think it's a very good solution in that kind of sense. But if it comes to it, I would say that they should remove it if it's very dangerous. But at the end of the day, it has its own advantage. So I wouldn't say that. Probably, yeah, I wouldn't give a yes or no answer to that. I'll just yeah, leave it like that.
Thank you. Thank you for your answer. So the second question is, as Islamophobia increases and fear increases, do you think that there is a parallel movement of positive interest in Islam because of the curiosity it creates?
Yeah, that's actually a good question. I think a lot of movement are actually in place now to try to understand Islam or to try to dialogue with Islam. And this also started with an initiative that started in the West. It talks about the idea of bringing Muslims together and even Jews to talk about their religion, try to understand it from their own perspective instead of just criticizing them for something that they don't even really have an understanding about. And there are lots of books that talks about how Islam and West can come together to come to an understanding as well. Hans Kung published a book on global ethics, that is, through ethics, Muslims and Christians and the West can come together and try to find a common ground to discuss and try to understand each other from a very neutral perspective, because ethics is something that everyone knows about. You know that it's a crime to kill, and this is what religion teaches us. So that way, it's also a movement as well. And there's another movement that is also talks about love in a way that through the concept of love that says love your neighbor as yourself, that we are obliged to express love, to extend love to anyone, even if it's our enemy. It is our obligation as human beings. So this kind of movement are already in place, and with time and understanding, a good understanding of Islam would prevail.
Thank you very much, Adam, and thank you for all of the questions. So now we are going to briefly close for the prayer break, and we will be back promptly at 5:50. So see everyone later. Alaikum, everyone.
Assalamu alaikum. I think people are still maybe in the Maghrib prayer. Would you like to
Yes.
wait perhaps a few more minutes so that everybody's
Sure.
back?
Sure. We can wait a few minutes. Sure.
Absolutely. So apologies for the delay. So we'll just wait a few more minutes until we feel that people finish their prayer, and then we will start. Thank you so much.
Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Welcome back. So now we will move on to our next presenter, Hamim Azad. Hamim is a MA graduate of Islamic Studies with a specialization in Islamic thought and applied ethics as part of the class of 2020. He will be pursuing his second master's at King Abdulaziz University in Jeddah or his PhD at Marmara University in Turkey. Hamim will be looking into the ethics of procreation from the ancient female infanticide, Wa'd al-Banat, to the modern sex selection. Hamim, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Fama, for the introduction. Please allow to share my screen. Which one is that?
Hamim, if you look down, yes.
Does it show?
Yes, indeed. Thank you so much. All the best.
Okay. Pleasure. Okay, the topic of my presentation is the ethics of procreation from the ancient female infanticide to the modern sex selection. To begin, we will shortly introduce about the modern biomedically assisted sex selection. The process of sex selection involves techniques such as IVF and PGD. Is a technology helps extract egg from an woman's ovary and then getting it fertilized by sperm transferred back to the woman's uterus. Whereas PGD is the genetic diagnosis of embryos, which increases the chances of having a successful IVF process. So the process of IVF and PGD help the couples to get children that they otherwise would have never had in a natural way. Besides the infertility treatment, the processes of IVF and PGD can also be used for selecting the gender in the embryo stage, where 1 to 3 embryos with a specific gender are chosen to be implanted in the uterus, and others are frozen or destroyed. Now, this form of sex selection for non-medical reasons denotes preferring one gender over another gender for many social and economic reasons, which reminds us the scenario of pre-Islamic age, where having girls used to be thought of as a source of shame, disgrace, and humility in the family. Hence, girls were sometimes buried alive, which the Quran refers to as the phenomenon of female infanticide. Now, the practice of sex selection for non-medical reasons raises a number of questions. For instance, does sex selection for practice for non-medical reasons resemble the pre-Islamic notion of female infanticide? If not, would Islam allow the gender selection for non-medical reasons? The third, is terminating the surplus embryos in the process of selecting gender tantamount to killing or homicide? So we have tried to answer all these questions in our paper, which we will also address in our presentation today. In order to address these questions in a systematic way, at first, we will briefly present the phenomena of female infanticide of pre-Islamic Arabia and the reasons behind such a practice to assess whether or not the modern form of sex selection is motivated by the same reasons. Several verses in the Quran describe the custom of infanticide, which seems to have been widespread in the pre-Islamic Arab society for several reasons. After going through a good number of Quranic exegesis and their interpretations, we come to conclude that pre-Islamic Arab societies were involved in infanticide of both genders due to the fear of poverty. However, killing of the daughters prevailed, as we found in the exegesis. Another reason why daughters were sacrificed is due to the blind loyalty of pagan Arabs to their partners to whom they used to worship. Some exegesis mentioned that the partners here include the ones who used to serve the idols. So this was a ritualistic reason rather. Another reason why the Arab pagans used to commit female infanticide is due to the fear of disgrace and humiliation that they may have to go through once their daughters are taken as captives and then enslaved. Moreover, the pagan fathers were concerned that they would be forced to marry off their daughters to the people they didn't like. So we find that that tribes such as Khuja'a, Mudar, and Tamim were known especially for practicing this immoral custom of female infanticide. Okay, from Quranic verses and their interpretation, we find that there was a dominant preference for a particular gender, namely the male children, which also took the form of putting the life of early born female children to an end. So thus, in one way or another, one can speak of a primitive form of sex selection. However, in the modern time, biomedical advancements can help people to opt for sex selection by choosing to implant male embryos in the women and by avoiding the female embryos, and thus not killing any born female child as in the pre-Islamic Arabia. However, the question arises as to whether or not sex selection of any gender is allowed for non-medical reasons from an ethical and religious point of view, which will be answered now. With regard to the non-medical reasons for sex selection, majority of the Muslim scholars rule out its permissibility. They state that sex selection for non-medical reasons opens door to discrimination against female embryos and fetuses. And also sex selection would create a demographic imbalance in the society that may eventually lead to same-sex relations. Moreover, they argue that there is no basis for allowing the practice of sex selection, as sex is not a disease which must be determined in advance. On the other hand, we find a minority group, a group of scholars who find it permissible. They say that there is scriptural prohibition. Moreover, they argue that everything in the universe is available for our exploitations and can be explored and used by human as long as there is no harm in it. Moreover, they argue that if asking or praying to God for son or daughter is allowed, it should be also permissible to pursue it in action. In that case, the sex selection, to take sex selection into action. Okay. So we also find that some Muslim scholars and physicians who stood by the opinion of the majority, i.e. who ruled out the permissibility, they, however, opined that social reasons can be considered to a certain extent in Islam. They argue that the general prohibition of sex selection may lead some women to vulnerable situations in many societies where having sons remains central to women's well-being and status. Also, family balancing may be considered acceptable for families where several girls have been delivered by the wife and there is no boy, or the vice versa. However, they put two conditions here. They said that there cannot be any prejudice against either sex, and the processes cannot involve any third party. Remarkably, both the opponents and proponents of sex selection focus on either the good or bad consequences of this practice without touching upon the moral status of the embryo. However, discussing the moral status of embryo is important, as modern sex selection process involves creating more than one embryo, where surplus embryos are ultimately terminated. Whether the destruction of these surplus embryos is an act of killing or not can be better understood by determining the exact beginning of human life. So the scholars also have varied in their opinions on the specific moment of life. For example, we find that all the classical scholars and major contemporary scholars state that soul breathing is the beginning of human life, i.e., life starts when there is ensoulment process that takes place after 120 days of gestation. So this is proved by the prophetic report that has been narrated by Ibn Mas'ud. Moreover, they reasoned that if death occurs when the soul leaves, life should start when the soul is breathed in. They also argue that the scriptural text, i.e. the prophetic narration by Ibn Mas'ud, is definitive and is not open for any interpretation. Also, they added scientific knowledge is speculative in nature and thus can change over time. On the other hand, we find a group of scholars and Muslim physicians who state that conception is the initial point of human life, i.e. life starts when the egg of woman gets fertilized by the sperm of man. They reasoned that the discovery of modern biomedical knowledge demonstrates that embryogenesis is an entirely constant process. Moreover, they argue that the practical ruling in Islam, one of the arguments, the practical ruling in Islamic law considers pregnancy as a valid excuse to postpone death sentence on pregnant women without any differentiation between the period before or after the soul breathing. So they mean to say that sex, in that case, life starts right with the conception and life should be protected from that moment on. Now, we will try to find the answers of the...
I'm so
Yes.
sorry. I just wanted to give you just the 10-minute check-in.
Okay.
So if you don't mind.
I'll just take 2 more minutes if possible.
Okay, no problem. No problem.
Okay. So we'll try to answer the questions that we tried to raise. Is terminating the surplus embryos in the process of selecting gender tantamount to killing or homicide? So if we take the opinion of the majority of the scholars who link the beginning of human life to the moment of ensoulment, we find out that the surplus embryos would have no life. Thus, they cannot be deemed killing. Muslim scholars only, majority of the Muslim scholars only provide sanctity to the implanted embryos. However, if we take the view of the minority position, who say that woman's egg, the life starts when woman's egg gets fertilized by the man's sperm, in that case, embryos in the IVF process would be seen as human beings. Thus, destroying any embryos in the process of selecting the sex will raise serious ethical questions about possible infanticide. Now, does sex selection practice for non-medical reasons resemble the pre-Islamic notion of female infanticide? I would actually say not strictly, because sex selection process for non-medical reasons does not involve terminating an already existing human life. However, there are still similarities between the sex selection and the notion of female infanticide. As we can see in sex selection process, the process itself blocks a potential human life from taking its normal course of growth. And this is by choosing not to implant the female embryos due to its gender. And moreover, the sex selection process and female infanticide imply the same preference for a specific gender for more or less the same reasons of infanticide, like social shame and economic reasons. Now, would Islam allow the gender selection for non-medical reasons? Majority of the scholars are against it, and this is due to the social shame and humiliation and due to the bad consequences of the practice, such as preferring one gender over another, and the fear of widespread misuses of these techniques. Moreover, they added that such practice on the public level can become an attempt to change the universal order of God. Now we come to our conclusion. We would like to advocate banning sex selection for medical reasons in principle. However, because it is an entry to the gender discrimination, and which can be a replica of somehow a modernist form of the Jahili infanticide, as this is because surplus embryos are destroyed in the process of sex selection, which would not happen if a natural pregnancy takes place. However, the general ban can lead to some other negative consequences, such as oppression against women in societies where women would be threatened, humiliated, or sometimes divorced if sons cannot be delivered. Therefore, for the greater benefit of women, the general prohibition should not be strictly and unconditionally upheld. Hence, the particular case of sex selection for non-medical reasons should be permitted or forbidden based on the merit of each case. And moreover, this should be observed by such committee who is well informed of the Sharia medical ethics and understand the religious and social implications of medical practices. Thank you so much. With this, I end.
Thank you very much, Hamim, for such an interesting presentation. So we will move on to the Q&A portion. And just a reminder for everyone, if you have any questions, you can just submit your question in the question box at the bottom right-hand corner. So the first question we have is, in the case of IVF, some embryos may be used while the balance is frozen. Is there any ethical dilemma on freezing these for later use?
Mm-hmm. So there are also research regarding this. If I scholars do permit freezing the embryos, but in that case, these have to be used only when the husband is alive and can be used after the death of the husband. This is like the scholar's opinion, some of the scholars' opinion.
Thank you very much. And just one more question. In the case of gender selection, there's a clear prohibition for choosing to have boys. However, in the context of states where high male-female ratio imbalances exist, where men far outnumber women and can possibly lead to other social issues, do you think the same dilemma applies when preferring to choose a girl? Or does the prohibition of gender selection stand no matter what?
Yeah, it just stands. It just stands. But as I told, there are some cases, like some scholars would say that if many girls are born in a family where there is no son, probably this is the last delivery. That would be the last pregnancy. In that case, some scholars tend to agree. I mean, tend to permit the sex selection process. But usually the impermissibility stands in principle.
Okay. Thank you so much, Hamim. Thank you for your presentation and also answering the questions. So the next presenter
Thank you so much.
is Yuhan. Is Yuhan Satapo. So Yuhan is an alumnus for the class of 2020 in the master's program in Islamic finance. He is interested in SDGs, volunteerism, and community development. Hailing from Thailand, he has spent many years participating in local and international volunteering opportunities, community services, and academic conferences and competitions. His interest in different disciplines has compelled him to currently work as an advocate for community development for one of the local NGOs in Thailand, promoting social entrepreneurship and peace. Recently, HBKU recognized him with the Student Life Awards for 2 consecutive years, in addition to the international recognition of Beta Gamma Sigma membership since 2017. He will present his paper on whether SDG performance lead to higher financial performance, the case of Dow Jones Islamic Market, World Index, and the heavy industry sector. So Yuhan, if you're ready, the floor is yours.
Thank you for such a lengthy introduction, but I'm sorry to bother with that information. So it's my honor to share my humble opinion on this particular topic. So I'll share my screen. Can you all see my screen? So great. Basically, my topic for today's discussion will be on my thesis. So the topic goes about like how does the SDG performance lead to higher financial performance in case of Dow Jones Islamic Market World Index, particularly on heavy industry sectors firm. So These are all what we are going to see through my presentation, but don't worry about it. And when it comes to SDGs, I'm sure everyone must be familiar, but allow me to bring up some facts when it comes to environment. If you can see from the first data, we will see that the half of the world population are lacking of fresh water, and 3 billion people lack of access to clean cooking bowls, and over 3 billion people depend on marine and coastal biodiversity. And we can see a lot of percentage when it comes to land degradation. So these are all the data reported by United Nations. So we can see these are what's happening in our world today. And so there will be possibility to cope with this kind of damage through the call of SDGs, so Sustainable Development Goals. So the United Nations introduced this um, framework covering 17 goals, but however, my research focused on only environmental aspect. So I categorize them into 5 Ps, which is people, prosperity, peace, partnership, including as well as the um, planet. So my focus will be on planet. Out of 17, I focus on planet, and that will include 6 goals pertaining water, energy, life on land, the consumption as well as the production, life underwater, and then climate change. So out of these 6 is most relevant to my research focus because I focus on the environmental aspect when it comes to measure the SDGs performance. And this is my data or findings so far upon my research. So what we can see is actually that these SDGs, Sustainable Development Goals, are actually globally weak, and this is reported by the Department of Economic and Social Affairs of United Nations. And what more is actually, it shows the urgent attention for all of the stakeholders to help the SDGs achieve by 2030. And when it comes to my research, I focus on heavy industry. That means private sector, because private sector is actually key stakeholders using the social resources to satisfy or to respond to their needs and as interests. So of course, it's their responsibility to ensure and protect the well-being of our community in return. And particularly to Dow Jones Islamic Market Index, I have found some, but it's a little bit devotion to this Dow Jones Index. That's why I come up with this kind of research. As you can see, I have found so far the studies on CSR, corporate social responsibility, environment, company performance. So these studies shows the relationship, and however, certain areas, certain region of this world shows no relationship between CSR, environment, and company performance. While other aspects of other parts of the world, African and Europe, they found negative relationship when it comes to environment and company performance. And there's also part of this connection with, and this across the globe shows the positive relationship when it comes to CSR, environment and company. But however, they haven't focused on SDGs because SDGs is actually the newly designed framework. And these are my objective for the research, to actually analyze the relationship connection between the SDGs environment, represented by RA, which is return on asset, while the second aim is actually to see the same connection, but represented by RE, which is return on equity. So in finance, we are familiar with these terms to measure our companies when it comes to financial performance, whether how well the company use the assets or equities to generate profits. And this is actually core concern when it comes to companies' operational output. And this is another research questions to see the environmental score is actually to measure the SDGs performance, while the share screen firm is actually my sample to see their return on asset as well as the return on equity, because higher environmental performance is expected to increase the reputation of the company and therefore increasing the profitability. That's why I am aiming to answer this kind of questions. And these are my research methodologies. I use secondary data for 10 years, and the sample initially was about 500 companies that listed on the DJI Market World Index that given by Thomson Reuters, so currently known as Thomson Definitive. And the heavy industries here refers to oil and gas, all the service, marketing, multi-line utilities, renewable energies industries. Why I focus on these industries actually, they are the most potential contributing positively, negatively to the environment. So, but basically is giving the negative impact on the environment because of the effects given by the oil industries and processing, operational processing from this kind of companies. And when it comes to financial performance, I use RA and RE as my measurement. When it comes to SDGs environmental score or SDG performance, I use the environmental score itself. And I use some other variables as well, like firm size when it comes to capital of the company and firm governance, ownership structure, and especially focusing on institutional ownership. And I have utilized certain statistical models in order to come up with my regressions and analysis. So when it comes to environmental score, I use this methodology given by Thomson Reuters. So when it comes to SDGs combined score, you will see that SDG score minus SDGs controversy score. But however, under SDG score, we have environmental, social, and governance. And in my case, I'm using environmental score, which focusing on research use, emissions, and innovations. And basically, these are my hypotheses that shows the SDG environmental score will lead to higher financial performance of the selected Sharia screen firms represented by RA and RE. And this is my research framework. As you can see, we have the collection and using the regressions, data testing, and what makes this research unique is actually testing the research by eliminating the autocorrelations as well as the heteroscedasticity by different methods in order to make sure that the result coming out from this research is actually valid. And in addition, you also make sure that there's no bias in my research by using the blue, the best linear unbiased, or we call best linear unbiased. So these are actually the tools that to make sure the result is not biased. And this is my result. I'm sorry to bury with the figures, but let me move on to the findings. So if you can see, there's impact on the SDG environmental score. If let's say if there's change in SDGs environmental score by 1%, that shows almost 18% of the change on ROA. It means the financial performance. The better SDGs score, the better ROA's performance. And also you can see here how much does R squared help indicate or the usefulness of the result or the model. So you can see 79%. It means there's high quality implication on this variable use. And at the same time, as you can see, there's no autocorrelation heterogeneity, and that includes my SDGs environmental score lead to higher financial performance. And when it comes to RA, and another finding, as you can see, there's a 1% change in environmental score that will increase about almost 12% in RA, which is financial performance. And I'm sorry, this is a little bit error here, negative. It actually shows positive relationship. And as you can see, there's no autocorrelations, the problem of heteroscedasticity, and that shows the good environmental score will increase the financial performance by measuring the return on asset. And when now I'm concluding
So
my
sorry to interrupt,
presentation.
Han.
Sure.
I'm so sorry. Just wanted to give you about a 10-minute check.
Sure. I'll need 1 minute to conclude my presentation. That's it. Will that be okay?
Yes, sure.
Yeah, sure. So out of this presentation, my research found that the SDG environment score or performance has a significantly positive impact on financial performance, and other variable also have a significant impact on the financial performance. And now the study recommends or suggests that firms could have a higher financial performance if they invest more on resource use, increasing the corporate innovation, as well as help reducing carbon dioxide emissions. And at the same time, the firm should invest further to SDGs in order to help the SDGs call of action achieved by 2030. Thank you, Farma. That's all from my presentation. Thank you all.
Thank you very much, Yuhan.
My pleasure.
Thank you very much. So now, anyone who has questions, please feel free to submit your questions in the question box. Okay, so one question is, based on your study, Yuhan, what implication does environmental score have?
Well, Farma, thank you so much for these questions. When it comes to SDGs performance, we have to see the all aspect, but however, the studies focus on environmental aspect. That includes only the resource use, innovations, and emissions. And this resources actually reflects how company give an effort or initiative to help reduce the emissions, help reduce the material use, energy, and water, this kind of resource use. And at the same time, we also it reflects that emissions, how much companies give an efforts to reduce the environmental emissions during their process on productions. And the last one will be the innovations, how much the company given efforts to help reduce the burdens or environmental burdens on behalf of the customers. So this implies these three aspects when it comes to environmental score. Yeah, Farma.
Thank you very much. Just wanted to remind everyone about questions. So if you have any questions, please feel free to submit the questions in the box. We do have another question. So how does your research relate to the empowerment of the SDGs?
Great. The finding shows that the higher environmental score leads to higher financial performance. That means the more efforts the company put forward the investment or support in achieving in help protecting the environment, they also increase their values when it comes to financial performance. So they will have high investment environmental in environment, and at the same time they also increase their reputation that will increase their financial performance. So when it comes to this finding, this shows that the more you help SDGs achieve, the better the values of the company will be. Yeah. So that shows the relationship between the research funding and the SDGs.
Thank you very much, Johan. Thank you
My
for
pleasure,
answering
Palma.
my questions, and thank you for your presentation. So the next presenter is Mubarak Musa. Mubarak graduated from the master's program in Islamic finance in spring of 2020. His research interests are primarily in the stock market and Islamic capital market products. He will present his paper on margin trading and short selling from a Sharia perspective. So Mubarak, if you're ready, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Palma. Assalamu alaikum. Sorry, I'm trying to. I don't have permission. How do I share the slides? Okay, yeah. I have permission. Okay. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله. إن الحمد لله نحمده ونستعينه ونستغفره ونعوذ بالله من شرور أنفسنا وسيئات أعمالنا. First of all, thank you, Palma, and I'm really, really happy and excited to be here among you. My paper is entitled Margin Trading and Short Selling from a Sharia Perspective. My name, as it from on the screen, is Mubarak Muhammad Kabir Musa. So the background. Well, basically, if you're following the news, like nowadays, if you're following the news, you must have heard a lot about stock market and how a lot of people have made millions. I mean, I'm talking about kids, like kids in high school, college students had made millions by trading in the stock market. So how did that happen? Like what happened? What happened to the stock market that these inexperienced kids were able to make that such of money, or that kind of money? So the easy answer will be like there was margin trading and short selling involved as the background. So we're going to start with margin trading. What is margin trading like? Basically, let's assume like you're planning on buying the stock of Samsung. The stock of Samsung today is 10 Qatari riyals, right? So, and you have 30 Qatari riyals. With your money, you can buy 3 stocks of Samsung, right? Because you have 30 Qatari riyals, the price of Samsung, stock of Samsung today is 10 Qatari riyals, right? So you can get 3. But let's assume that you are expecting that the price of the stock of Samsung is going to increase in, let's say, next week. But you don't have money and you want to buy more of Samsung, or more of the stocks of Samsung. So what is, you go to a brokerage firm, or you speak to your broker and you tell him, okay, I want to buy this much stocks, but I only have 30 riyals. Can I borrow like more money from you, so I can buy more stocks. So the broker will be like, okay, it's not a big deal. You can get as much as you want. So the broker will lend money to me, for example, and let's say you will lend 70 riyals. So with the 70 riyals, including my 30 riyals, I will have like 100 riyals, and then I can buy like 10 stocks of Samsung. So basically, in a simple way, that is margin trading. Margin trading is just about borrowing money from a broker to purchase stock. My money will be used. So once you purchase the stock, the broker will keep the stocks with him in an account called a margin account. So the stocks that are being purchased will be kept with the broker as collateral, right? Guarantee that nothing will happen and all that. So once the price of the stock increases, let's say in next week, the price increased from 10 to 15 riyal. So you speak to your broker and tell him, okay, now I want to sell my stocks. So once you sell the stocks, you'll make like 50 riyals. Like at the end of the day, you're going to sell it for 150 riyals. So you'll make 50 additional 50 riyals on top of the money the stock you've purchased. Return your money you had borrowed from the broker and keep the profit with you. So now what are the benefits of margin trading? Margin trading helps increase the liquidity in stock market. Liquidity means like how fast stocks are being bought and sold in the stock market. And it also gives investors a better rate of return, right? Okay, so there are risks to using margin trading. One of the risks is like, okay, you're going to borrow money from a broker to purchase stocks. So what happens if you're expecting the price to go up? What the actual price goes down? There is a huge risk, right? You only had 30 riyals. You had borrowed 70 riyals from the broker and went down to 5 riyals. You're losing a lot of money. So there is a huge risk. And also once the price starts to go down, there's something called the margin call. The broker will tell you, okay, man, you have to give me additional money to cover your position and all that. There's also that. Now let's go to the Sharia aspect of it. Definitely, if you look at the literatures of Fuqaha, you will never find margin trading. You won't find margin trade like Muwatta of Imam Malik or Al-Umm of Shafi'i talking about hukum margin trading. No, it's a new phenomenon, right? It wasn't there before. So how do we arrive at the Sharia ruling of such thing? To arrive at the Sharia of such thing, you'll have to use what is called Taqib Fiqh, which is Sharia adaptation or Sharia characterization. So if we use that, we'll have to, how do you use that? Is like you have to look at every step of the process. Like you have to define, okay, what is, let's start with margin trading. What is the relationship between the broker and the client? From a Sharia perspective, they will say, okay, it's qard, because qard means a debt relationship, right? You are borrowing, so it's qard. So for it to be Sharia compliant, it has to satisfy all the rules of loan contract, right? Secondly, there are Sharia issues with using margin trading. First of all, we said the stocks that are borrowed would be, or the stocks that are bought will be kept with as collateral, right? And the broker will definitely benefit from those stocks that are kept with him. How will he benefit from those stocks? We'll see in the next slides. And also, the broker will not be lending money to me, for example, for free, right? He'll be charging interest. Also, there is an issue on, as we all know, that interest is haram from a Sharia perspective. And also, there is issue of pledging shares, benefiting from the pledged shares. And in general, the margin trading as practiced in conventional markets in US and all the other places, it's impermissible, haram, because first there's interest, second the broker is benefiting from the pledged stocks and other reasons. Next, we move to short selling. Short selling is a bit complex, right? Normal case, like with margin trading, is like you buy something in anticipation of an increase in the price, right? So you buy something, let's say today 10 riyals, and you are expecting the price to go up like in a week to 15 riyals. That's what rational people do. But with short selling, let's say you are expecting the price of Samsung stocks, which is 10 riyals today. You're expecting the price to go down to 5 riyals next week, right? It's 10 riyals today, but it might go down to 5 riyals next week. But you don't have the stock with you right now. So what do? You go to the broker and you tell him, okay, can I borrow? Here you are borrowing. Here you, in margin trading, you're borrowing money, right? Here you go to a broker and you tell him, can I borrow the stocks of, let's say, Samsung? And he will say, okay, no problem. I have this much quantity. How much do you need? 20. Then you will borrow the stocks of Samsung today. And you will take the borrowed stocks and sell them in the market for 10 riyals. Now the price today is 10 riyals, right? You sell them in the market for 10 riyals today. What will happen is, let's assume after a week, the price went down. You go back to the market, went down to 5 riyals, go back to the market, purchase the same stocks at 5 riyals, then return the same stocks back to the broker. So you'll be making the difference between the actual price you sold initially and the price you bought from the market at a later stage. Now, there are a lot of motives for short selling, but we're going to skip them. The Sharia jurisprudential, we've talked about characterization. First, the relationship between the broker and the client, for example, is that of like loan, right? So he's borrowing shares from a broker, right? It's a loan. So now, what are the major issues that might arise from this? First, there is the issue of selling something before you actually own it, which is from a Sharia perspective is impermissible. And it does happen in margin trading. And also there is something called substitute payment that it's been practiced in the market. Now I looked at the attempts, there's been attempts to construct a Sharia compliant margin trading and short selling. We've said that margin trading, both margin trading and short selling as practiced in the conventional market is impermissible. So what some institutions in the Arab region and in US have tried to come up with an alternative, a Sharia compliant alternative. So I looked at two alternatives. One is Rams Securities, which is in UAE. The other one is the Group Security in Qatar, sorry. And both are using the Qard Hasan, right, which is interest-free loan, right? For example, let's look at the group which is in Qatar. They say, okay, we can lend you money. In margin trading, we'll give you money to buy stocks. You won't pay anything, but you have like 7 days. If you return the money in 7 days, you don't pay anything. After 7 days, you'll pay interest. You'll pay something. So what's the ruling from a Sharia perspective? We've analyzed that, and we've looked at the ruling of IOP and others, which stated that such condition is impermissible, and therefore the practice of margin trading in the group securities is also impermissible. Rams Security, same thing, but with Rams it was a bit complicated because they were claiming to use interest-free loan. However, they were using clearly interest loan, like loans with interest. It was obvious, which is strange a bit. Next, we have Sharia compliant short selling. we looked at the ward-based structure. There are different structures that had been employed. A ward-based structure, it was used by Amiri Capital, which is in the US. And the second one was Al-Fanar, also in the US and in UAE. One is using ward-based structure. We arrived at a ruling that such structure is impermissible. Salam-based structure, also we said it's impermissible. However, my opinion has changed with regard to Salam-based structure, as now I believe that you can use Salam to purchase shares. Conclusion or recommendation.
Sorry to interrupt you. Just wanted to give you, the 10-minute check-in.
Yeah, thank you. Conclusion, well, I would say a recommendation, short selling, for example. For short selling, it's impermissible as practiced in the conventional markets. Margin trading as practiced in the conventional markets is also impermissible. The alternatives that have been developed and the ones that I have analyzed are also not really permissible. Can we develop a Sharia compliant margin trading and short selling? Yes, we can. It's easy, but there is no incentive to do that. And finally, I will advise everyone, like students and all that. I know a lot of people are thinking of using margin trading or short selling nowadays. I will advise people to avoid and to refrain from using such facilities because they are extremely dangerous and risky. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mubarak, for your presentation. So if anyone has questions, please feel free to submit your questions in the question box. So we have one question. You have highlighted several Sharia concerns with trading stocks using margin trading. However, I would like to know whether that also applies to FX and Bitcoin, or is there a different dynamic?
Thank you very much for this question. Well, yeah, it also applies to foreign exchange and to Bitcoin, but the difference is, I think with foreign exchange, you have to comply with additional ruling with regards to trading currencies. With Bitcoin, there are several Sharia concerns whether Bitcoin itself is Sharia permissible or not, but it also applies. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And we have one more question. In your analysis, you found products that are supposed to be Sharia compliant, but it was not in compliance. Are there national or regional bodies that regulate the compliance of such products?
Yeah, there was several conferences on margin trading and short selling. They tried to analyze the Sharia rulings of these instruments. However, it's difficult to get the actual ruling of these scholars, like the proceeding of these conferences, because, as I said, huge companies in the US and in Qatar and all that are practicing margin trading and short selling. So they won't like to say something negative, which will definitely affect the practices of these institutions.
Thank you very much. We do have one more question. Wasn't the RAM's prospectus approved by the Sharia board?
Yes, it was approved. Well, Islamic finance, there are a lot of gray areas, but it was approved by a Sharia board. You can approve anything, right? Depending on who you have as on your board, right? It was approved by the Sharia board, but there are a lot of Sharia concerns. I've showed the structure to other scholars, and they were really surprised. Like, how can Sharia scholars approve such structure? That's what you have in Islamic finance.
Thank you very much, Mubarak, for your wonderful presentation, and thank you for answering our questions.
Thank you.
So the next presenter we have is Samiha Abdussamad. Samiha is part of the class of 2021 Master's Program in Islamic Art, Architecture, and Urbanism. She pursued her higher studies in India, where she earned her bachelor's degree in architecture from the University of Calicut, Kerala, with a thesis on housing for the urban poor in West Cochin. She has been engaged in many social works and volunteering works in Qatar and in India, such as being a member of the Women Grid for the Sowing Hope Project, an initiative by Irvi Foundation developed exclusively for the well-being of people in the slums of Kerala and concentrating on the empowerment of womankind. She is part of the class of 2021 with her thesis on community development for Syrian refugees through housing strategies. Today, she explores architecture through her paper on Islamic perspectives and alternatives to the existing model. So, Samiha, if you're ready, floor is yours.
Thank you. Assalamu alaikum. Good evening, everyone. It's good to have you all here today, this evening, and also all the wonderful presentations from our colleagues. I'm sure there's more to come also. Before I start, I would like to express my wholehearted thanks to the CIS team who have given me such an opportunity to present my work to the larger academic scene, and it's been a great honor. So to start this paper, it attempts to examine the defects in the current worldview of sustainability and present a hypothesis that considering Islamic principles in the conventional model may help us to develop a more effective model and provide better results. And it also narrows down its focus on the social component of sustainability through architectural practices, examines the pros and cons produced while integrating Western practices into cultures that show strong adherence to traditions. And it discusses maintaining the local tradition and practices that are culture and climate appropriate for the region, as well as being environmentally friendly and economical, which are a much sought after factor in urban design in this current scenario of global pandemic. So our interaction with the environment has made it a victim, paving way to one of the greatest crises we have to deal with. And the over-dependence of natural resources have put a strain on them, causing their depletion. The beginning of 1960s, it marks the way how we started changing our ways to harness the resources, and we started questioning the power of technological progress. And this was what helped set the stage for environmental movement. In architecture, historically, it has been evolving based on the social and climatic conditions of various regions and cultures with different approaches taken. But globalization brought an internationalization of architecture through modernism, and this led to the eradication of cultural identity. So although the movement of globalization unified and the architectural language, it brought out senses of pollution, land degradation, and exhaustion of natural resources. So there emerged the need to mitigate the negative effects of this aggressive pursuit of nature. It started off as the greening of architecture, which was aimed to transform the modern architecture into more environmentally oriented approach. And several architects of the 20th century, they tended to integrate climatic design principles into the modernist forms with different technologies and materials, but treating the problem using the very practices that created them would not work. And so later on in the 2000s, the notion of green was gradually replaced by sustainability and its constantly evolving even today. So this realization of the immense pressure that humanity placed upon the environment, it led the organizations like UN to take up the cause, and they organized world summits where goal was set to harness the resources in such a way that it met the needs of the present generation without compromising the needs of the future. This was the concept of sustainability as first appeared in the Brundtland Report by the United Nations. And there was another resolution adopted where the three major components of sustainable development was defined as the economic, social, and environmental. And these were interdependent, mutually reinforcing pillars. But despite these calls and for a fresh start, there was this challenge of sustainability still exists in our times, particularly because there is no construction industry that sets sustainability at the heart of its operation. So such a mindset, it hampered the application of the principles and it could not produce the desired effect. Environment was considered equal footing with economy and social well-being. When put into practice, this evolved into a market-based economy where there was little to no consideration for the environment. The social scholars, Neil Dave and Kenneth Ryan, they wrote in there, they argued in their article that if you considered the sustainable development model as a stool, three-legged stool, you cannot consider the environment component as a leg of sustainable development stool, but rather the floor upon which it must stand. So this three-pillared model, it was a flaw because it discounted the future and encouraged overconsumption. Hence, the irony was that even when the 20th century was heralded as the era of sustainability, the global human enterprise, they were rapidly becoming less sustainable. Now, Jane Jacobs, in her most renowned work, The Death and Life of American Cities, she says that the cities of a postmodern world, they are really antithesis to nature because they limited the notion of nature to just grass, fresh air, and little else. She says that the social behavior of people were affected by city planning, which in turn affected the economic behavior of the cities. We see this in the case of the Fruit Ego housing project, one of America's most notorious housing projects, where it failed to meet the expectations of the planners and authorities as a solution for urban poor in the city. It deteriorated into a crime-ridden, infamous lane, and it was eventually imploded with dynamites. So it is here we need to scrutinize the connection between the three major components of sustainable development. And so we see that it is impossible to consider them separately. And the UN has now formulated these 17 practical challenges which revolve around the components almost in an equal manner. So while considering the role of religious consciousness in formation of sustainable attitudes, we cannot ignore vantage point of Islam, and it deserves as much attention as any, because the concept of sustainability, it's not new to Islam. It existed for centuries in Holy Quran and Hadith, and they both provide a framework for mankind on how to interact with their surrounding, that is the environment, and also it encourages to maintain a balance in the universe that was designed by God. So this shows that the concept of sustainable development, it took root in the 7th century Islamic ideology itself, but it did not get translated into the modern context until this 20th century. Here you can see the definition for sustainable development in Islam provided by Dr. Iyad Mohsin, who is the head of the United Nations Environment Program. So many intellectuals, they have now formulated basic principles with regards to sustainability in Islam. The first platform that identified these principles were the Knowledge and Value Seminar in Stockholm in the 1980s. So how they formed these ideas, the foundational idea for the principles were the two overarching concepts, that is the one is the doctrine of unity of God, the Tawheed, which dictates the acceptance of God as the only source of all values. which means that one who follows it, it will inculcate a psychological and behavioral attitude, and whatever he does, thinks or feels will be motivated by this quest for unity. And the second one was man as a representative of God, the Khalifa, because the very basis of human existence was to infuse the natural world with the transcendental, the revealed ethics, and this role, in case he fails to abide by it, it will bring in about calamities and destruction, fasad for man himself, as indicated in the Quranic verses. So from these two principles, we derive the other principles of sustainability in Islam, which is the concept of Earth's custodianship of Earth's assets, that is the amana, where the problems we face today with the environment are due to absence of this custodianship, because man is not held accountable for his actions. Then it's the intrinsic state of purity, where it is essential to use elements of the environment in their natural state without corruption and in full harmony with nature, people, and built environment. When we construct the practices of today, they are heavily dependent on the fossil fuel energy, and these have a negative impact on health. And also the lack of natural ventilation, lighting, etc., have also led to ecological degradation. Another principle is the pre-existing order of the universe, that is the balance, the mizan, which is put forth as a divine law, that is, do not commit excess in the Quran. So any deviation from this command will be abstaining to, will be extravagance, that is itraf, and it will disrupt the harmonious relation of man with nature and result in unspeakable ecological crisis. Then the path of moderation, that is wasat, we have to utilize the resources and considerately and moderately benefiting from it, but at the same time, we have to pass it on to the next generation in excellent condition. So this neutral approach of wasat, it actually symbolizes the amana and the need to be implemented by the Khalifa. Then comes the economic and social justice, that is adl, where all of the nature's resources, they are a joint property of the mankind, and we have to take precautions to safeguard the interests and rights of others. And this deliverance of justice is not just limited to humans alone, but it should also encompass every living creature and natural resources. And abusing any of this, it will be considered a sin. And finally, it is the perfection in actions, that is ihsan. Developments shall not be meaningless and without necessity, because it will contribute to overintelligence and wastage of resources. And the Holy Quran encourages man to do good as God has done good to you. So we can observe the examples since the time of Prophet Muhammad, who has implemented these principles with manifesting the role of the Khalifa. And the overarching, again, the prophetic declaration was that there shall be no harm and no infliction of damage. And you can say that he was the one who pioneered implementation of conservation, of sustainable development and resource management. And if you look at the first forms of Islamic architecture in Medina, they were simple structures of palm leaves or bricks or whatever was available to them. And also they followed the principles of form follows function, which was a very recent principle, but it was done at that time too. And it was only that when anything was absolutely necessary, it was expanded or constructed. And Prophet also believed that not only humans, but animals, forests, watercourses, all have their rights, all have, this comes under adl. And he reserved specific zones called haram, which were wildlife and natural resources, as they were demarcated as a public property and common lands managed by the public authority for conserving the natural resources. So this became a symbol of social equity, rigorous justice, and an instrument of environmental conservation. Now, coming to the modern context, there are many examples, but the most effective one in terms of analyzing these principles will be that of the renowned Egyptian architect Hassan Fathi, whose philosophical approach pioneered the use of appropriate technology in the Arab Islamic world. And he, being a contemporary of the modern movement, he was not disillusioned by it, and he felt that missing the social and climate-oriented architecture and planning in the context. So he believed that the architect puts a building in two environments. One is the God-made, and that is the landscape and the flora and the fauna and the climate. And the other one is the man-made, the urban. And the design should be such that it achieved harmony between the house or the structure and its surroundings and complement the earth with its colors and forms, etc. He manifested this use through the usage of local materials and incorporated elements responsive to the climate, like courtyard, the car, the mashrabiya, the takhtabush, etc. And he held the view that architecture should be indigenous to the region and its people, and also as its own specific material, because each region and people have their own specific material, climate, and culture. So it was his planning was a method of balancing the needs of Islamic social system, and it provided clear separation of private life and also reflected the traditional role of men and women. So we see that human resources are a valuable asset of sustainable development. But today, the rapid growing population has put a pressure on the natural and economic resources such that there is an imbalance in both. When you relate the available resources and the population growth, it turns out to be insufficient. And it implies that the social development should meet the basic necessity of all and provide equal opportunity to all sections of the society. So traditional towns of Muslim nations, we see that they were formed based on the Islamic Sharia, and it followed the values of Islamic societies, like the importance of family, privacy for family life, encourage healthy lifestyle, etc. So we can see in the city of yes.
So sorry, I'm so sorry. So we've reached like more than the 10-minute mark. So
Yeah.
to wrap it up.
Yes, I'll be concluding soon. So you can see how it had this high like density, but you can see the climatic advantage was taken into account, and also there was a irregular shape in the urban fabric, which denoted originality. But in the post-colonial world, like you see on the right side, we followed, the Islamic world followed the Western models, and this created an irregular grid pattern and also lack of appropriate orientation. And so they had, there was a departure from the traditional practices. So today, the concentration of economic activities in the cities, they have raised a concern of, the housing quality, and it has been affecting the people, especially because of their disconnection with nature. And people, they have been, they yearn for a connection with nature. And any building typology that is devoid of the elements of nature, they can be distressing, and it can prove to be discomfort. This is especially relevant in case of the pandemic, because it was not just the substandard housing, but also the high-rise tower blocks, which caused high risk settings for outbreak of the infectious disease, and also put a strain on people's health, mental health. So to conclude, I would, yes, also another way is to maintain the historic parts of the cities so that they can be promoted as tourist hotspots, and also at the same time uphold the identity and integrity of local architecture. So to conclude, we can say that we shouldn't understand that modern technology is outside the framework of Islamic principles, but it is in fact, it coincides with that which is put forward by those goals that are put forward by the conventional model of sustainability. And if we have to consider these in a global context, there should be dialogues between both the sections of the Islamic model and the models of sustainability of the conventional world, and they should develop a connection and in order to establish more efficient approaches. So this is encouraging from secular studies, even because they indicate that religion significantly relates to performance of sustainable behaviors and maximizes the effectiveness of encouraging sustainable behaviors. So this is what was an overview of my paper. I hope you all have enjoyed it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Samiha. Thank you. That was a wonderful presentation. I just wanted to encourage people to submit their questions to the question box. So the first question is, in your paper, why did you choose a controversial architect as Hassan Fathy as an example?
Okay, so I wouldn't say that the failure of any project would have been the fault of the architect himself, because it also involves the social component. And in case of Hassan Fathy, the failure of some of his projects was a result of political, inefficiency and bureaucracy, etc. Also from incorporation of the people themselves. So when I mentioned the Pruitt Ego in America too, it was designed by a very renowned architect, Yamasaki, who designed the World Trade Center too. His intention was very good, but unfortunately it did not work out. So many factors play into the success of a project.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Just, I think there's one more question. How would you suggest the identified principles of sustainability in Islam are put into practice?
Yes, so as I mentioned, we cannot necessarily just avoid these values, stating they are impractical or it only exists in theory, but you have to connect between the two. So I think like key players like the faith-based organization in the UN SDGs right now, they can use these principles as a framework to plan their operations, and in that way this can be put into practice on a global context.
Thank you very much, Samiha. And if there aren't any more questions, we will move on to our next presenter. Our next presenter is Natalia Bykova, and she is from the class of 2021 in the master's program in Islam and Global Affairs. Her interests lie in researching the implementation of legal policies in women empowerment in the Middle East, in Middle Eastern countries, social inclusion of minorities, and the social aspect of the use of artificial intelligence, including ethics and religion in smart technologies. So if you're ready, Natalia,
Assalamu alaikum. Good evening, everyone. Could you please give me an access so I can show my presentation? Yeah, thank you very much. Just 1 second. Okay, is everybody can see? I believe everyone can see.
Yes,
okay, wonderful. Okay, so today I'm going to give you a very short and brief information about a study that I've concluded during my master's studies at Hamad bin Khalifa University. And of course, the study is about the labor rights of national women in the Gulf Cooperation Council's member states, Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, Oman, Qatar, and United Arab Emirates. Well, the study has two, as I said, I am going to be very brief. The study includes 2 parts, general required parts, which is the introduction, methodology, conclusion, and results and analysis. And I have looked at 3 specific topics, which are the legal framework of the women labor rights, nationals only, and employment status and education, and gender perceptions in wage range. So I'm going to give you some data, and this data has been accumulated in terms of women involvement in labor, and this data has been accumulated between 1981, since the establishment of the council, and until 2019, and involves female participation age range between 18 and 60 years old. And as we all like numbers, so I'm going to give some numbers. According to national employment trends in the Council countries, the participation of female nationals in the workforce is really widest, starting from the highest number of 45% of women involved in labor in Kuwait, followed by United Arab Emirates, 44%. Afterwards, of course, Bahrain with 33%, Oman 26%, and Qatar is 36%. It's just between, and of course the lowest, which is Saudi Arabia, with 16. As I remember, the very recent report before the study to be submitted, which is from 2020 December, the numbers are increased a bit, up to 18% of women informal nationals. That does not include women from other countries into the labor force. So looking at the numbers, we can see that Kuwait is one of the 6 GCC countries that have been fostering women participation into the workforce. And this, of course, has happened also with some political change, some legal changes in political realm, which are very much related with the election, the change of the amendment, sorry, of the election law number 35 from 1962, which has been amended in 2005 and granted women the right to vote and run for office. Of course, looking at the legal framework also, which is one of the first specific topics that I've looked at, it is important to mention one very interesting fact that I came across, and that was during the timing of researching, which is 1981 and 2019, according to International Labour Law Organization, it shows that the number of GCC women nationals in employment has grown with every legal and social change that happens into the countries. And of course, the first thing that is coming in our mind when we are talking about political and social changes is Arab Spring. We know that Arab Spring influenced many countries. And one of the countries that influenced the most from the Gulf Cooperation countries, Council member states, is Bahrain. That was very much involved. Women were very much involved into promotion of equality together with men. And also Bahrain has the longest story of women's movement in Gulf region compared with other states. According to, and also we have to mention very important fact that Bahrain and Oman as well, both countries has a constitution, and in Bahrain constitution, according to Article 12, it's asserted that equal rights for both female and male citizens of the country, and we are talking about equal rights even in labor. So there, except Arab Spring that has influenced a lot the labor rights of women, and of course it brings many social changes, there are some big contributors according to the research that I've did, and these major contributors in women participation in labor law, in labor realm is the changing tendency in women access to education. And when we're talking about these changing tendencies, we are talking about the time after the late 50s and 60s, when we have noticed, and historically, of course, we know that Arabian Gulf was experiencing a high wealth due to oil. So one of the changes we have seen, and I have found out from this research, was exactly that then education, healthcare, social care become available for every citizen, and of course for women as well. So another very important fact, and something very interesting that I found out, was the urbanization. Urbanization also affects very much women, of course, women participation in labor, and also economic growth, as I mentioned before, and Arab Spring, of course. Among the GCC's countries, again, Kuwait appeared to be the most liberal in terms of gender equality in labor force we are talking about. But in the paper, I have mentioned this in terms of legal framework. But when it comes to gender perceptions in wage range, we can see that, for example, Bahrain and Oman is much more better situated than Kuwait, because in Kuwait there is no, according to my research until 2019, there was no settled basic range for wages in public and in private sphere. That makes the diversity in payments from employers to women and male quite big. For example, 63% of women are 63% of men getting high number of men getting 63% higher wages than a woman in Kuwait, according to this research. So when it comes to employment status, as I mentioned, urbanization, globalization, and economic growth have influenced a lot women participation in labor, and it is very. I found very interesting a study conducted in 2009 by the European University Institute that shows that education in humanities and religious studies does not adequately prepare GCC national women to compete with expatriates for jobs that in productive sectors. So this speaks that maybe the fact that they do not have the suitable education for the global market, it makes them not able to participate equally with other women, for example, or men into the labor force. So here we can find a little bit of these, that there is no legal constraints, but rather than social and political constraints that are related with involvement of women into labor force. And of course, when it comes to gender perceptions in the wage range, I came across a very interesting study. I was very impressed, a study made by a university in Bahrain. According to that study, the region particularly changed with the globalization. And what I mean is, that by these, that families become more dependent on women's wages. So women become greater contributors to the family. So therefore, seeing this, government started to make also some changes into the policies as well. And I would like also to say, in conclusion, that socially and culturally, Gulf region is changing rapidly, and we will see in the next few decades, how more women are undertaking higher position. They become more into the political realm and become more competitive together along with the men. And thank you very much for the time.
Thank you very much, Natalia, for that amazing presentation. Thank you. So now we're going to open up the Q&A portion. So if anyone has any questions, please feel free to submit your questions in the question box. So we do have one question. So studies show that female participation in education, and most especially higher education, is far outpacing that of men. So do you think this will lead to visible changes in women's participation in the workforce and change the challenges being faced today?
Absolutely. Well, I did not present some statistics, but in the paper you will find quite a lot of statistics in terms of how basically education is starting to change rapidly employment situation, employment picture. So more women are undertaking higher position, like they're becoming. I'm talking about the GCC countries. More women are becoming visible in politics or in legal sphere, which it wasn't very often seen in the past.
I see. Thank you so much. Thank you very much. We do have one more question. So most of the GCC countries have an expatriate majority. Have you come across any readings that show if the same trends in your report are also reflected amongst expatriate women in the workforce?
Okay, so unfortunately, my concentration was only in women nationals, so I was not able to look at the expatriates. But if the person is interested into this information, I have few colleagues from humanities. They are studying women and gender studies. So I'm sure, almost sure that they did some research about the participation of expatriates women, especially in Qatar, not only. Yeah, so I can connect and maybe they can provide some information.
Thank you very much, Natalia.
Thank
you for your presentation, and thank you for answering our questions.
Thank you.
And thank you to all of our presenters for an evening of thought-provoking scholarship and wide range of research interests. A very big thank you to our attendees for their engagement and support of research at CIS. So we recommend you take a look at the past issue of Astrolabe, a CIS student research journal online, and keep an eye out for the next issue with our current presenters' work in the fall of 2021. Have a great evening and thank you. Assalamu alaikum.